Here it is. This is where the Battle of Atlanta began. And there's actually a sign here. There was a man named Wilbur Kurtz who in the 1960s did a ton of research into where the things that happened in the Battle of Atlanta actually occurred. And he worked with this Georgia Historical Commission to put up markers around town. Most of them are so detailed about troop movements, they're almost unreadable. But this one is really nice because it gives us the starting point of the battle. But to tell you the truth, the starting point of the battle was just a little skirmish. Because when General Hardee was lost down there near Entrenchment Creek, and then he got help from William Cobb, he then split his troops into two portions. And one of them met the main Union lines in East Atlanta. And then the second portion of his troops kind of outflanked the Union. And so there were a few soldiers that ran into a few Union soldiers, and the first shots were fired here. But this wasn't where the major fighting happened, but it was the beginning point of one of the tragedies of the battle when Union General James McPherson was shot and killed. I'm gonna bicycle over to that exact spot where he died, and then I'll tell you that story. Come on. So when those shots were fired, General James McPherson was having a meal under some shade trees about a half-mile north of here. You remember James McPherson? Remember, he was Sherman's second in command who went to West Point with General John Bell Hood, the Confederate commander. McPherson, the one who predicted that there would be a sneak attack. So when he heard those shots, he immediately got on his horse. McPherson rode almost a half a mile to the south. And then he came out into a little clearing and found himself surrounded by Confederate soldiers. The Confederates must have been as surprised as McPherson was, but they raised their guns and told him to surrender. Story goes, McPherson doffed his hat, turned his horse around, and galloped off. The Confederates opened fire and shot him dead. And I think, we're almost at the place where McPherson fell off his horse and died. Back then, I guess there was a lot of chivalry because the Confederates immediately realized that they had killed one of the top Union generals. And so they stopped everything and allowed the Union soldiers to prepare his body and send his body back to General Sherman. Here's the spot where he died. Today, at the corner of McPherson Street and Monument Avenue, there's a monument to McPherson on the spot that he actually died. It's an upturned cannon symbolizing a U.S. general that was killed in action. When McPherson's body was brought to Sherman's headquarters, Sherman thought of McPherson as kind of an up-and-coming star of the U.S. Army, and some people have said that Sherman even thought of McPherson as kind of like his son. The story goes that Sherman actually shed a tear when he saw McPherson's body, and Sherman wasn't the kind of guy who cried often. But when they searched through McPherson's dead body, they didn't find his purse. Yes, men used purses back then, and inside that purse was McPherson's journal, where he had all of his plans for the Battle of Atlanta. Does that mean the Confederates had them? I'll tell you that next part of the story as we ride on to where the fighting really began. So this journal, full of McPherson's war plans, had likely fallen into the hands of the Confederates, but there's nothing Sherman could do about it. So he appointed General John Blackjack Logan to be in charge of McPherson's troops. Logan was a hugely popular general, and they just had to keep fighting because the attack was definitely underway. So whatever happened to that notebook full of war notes? Well, it never made it into the hands of Confederate General Hood. Instead, the Confederate runner who was supposed to carry the McPherson's journal to Hood never made it there. He was captured by Federal troops, and at the end of the day, when Southern prisoners of war were being searched, there was McPherson's journal. The battle is fully underway now, and I'm headed to the fiercest area of fighting of the whole battle, a place that has two names, Bald Hill and Leggett's Hill. So I'm gonna huff and puff my way up this hill and then I'll see you there. I'm not even gonna try to bicycle across this. This is the I-20 bridge, but it's the site of what used to be Leggett's Hill. Well, the Confederates called it Bald Hill, but the Union named it after General Leggett, Mortimer Leggett, who originally took the hill as the highest ground on this side of the fortifications of Atlanta. And it's this spot where the fiercest fighting of the Battle of Atlanta occurred. Today, though, it's not that at all. It's just an interstate highway. All right, I guess this is where Leggett's Hill would have been if it wasn't bulldozed. And the Union troops were lined up all up and down Moreland Avenue here. Of course, it wasn't Moreland at the time. About a mile from downtown Atlanta. They didn't have skyscrapers back then, but the skyscrapers you can see are a good marker to show us how far away we are. About a mile, just at the far reach of mortar fire range. So, when the Confederate troops attacked from the south after Hardee's night march, and more Confederate troops attacked from the west, this site right here was a bloody, bloody battle, and the Federal troops almost lost. But they held their ground right here at Leggett's Hill. Once this part of the fighting was over, the Confederates made one last-ditch attempt to take the high ground, which is now Moreland Avenue. And once I walk across this interstate interchange, then I'll bicycle my way to that last part of the battleground. One that's pretty famous because it's the featured story in the Battle of Atlanta cyclorama painting that you might have seen at the Atlanta History Center. Here we are at our final stop on our Battle of Atlanta bicycle tour, and it's a parking lot and a shopping center. Not super scenic, but this is the spot where the definitive action happened in the Battle of Atlanta. I'm going to tell you a little bit of the story, but what you should really do is go to the Atlanta History Center and look at that 360-degree painting that they call the cyclorama, because that depicts what happened in this parking lot. Well, this wasn't a parking lot, of course. It was a cornfield, maybe a wheat field. A large field of grain spreading out over this whole area that's now covered with asphalt. And the Confederate soldiers, in a last-ditch attempt to salvage this particular battle, marched out what's now called DeKalb Avenue, and at that time was called the Decatur Road, from Atlanta towards Decatur, right along the Georgia rail line. When they got to just about this area right here, they broke through Union lines and sent the Union soldiers scattering across the field. Well, remember the general who took the place of the deceased General McPherson? His name was Blackjack, his nickname, Logan. And Logan was so popular, he rode across the battlefield calling his troops back together. He said, "Fall back in your lines, fall back in your lines." And they eventually formed a long line, and Logan had his men push the Confederates back across the field towards the Decatur Road. The Confederate soldiers broke ranks and ran back to Atlanta. And the Battle of Atlanta was won by the Union. The Battle of Atlanta is one part of the Atlanta campaign. So just imagine Atlanta kind of like a circle, and there was rail lines coming in from each of the cardinal directions. So Sherman had already taken the railroads to the north, and this battle solidified the railroads on the east side of Atlanta. About a month later, the Battle of Ezra Church meant that Sherman had cut off the rail lines on the west. Finally, as depicted in the famous movie Gone with the Wind, the rail lines to the south were captured in the Battle of Jonesboro, and Atlanta was cut off from supplies. It was at that point where the Confederates abandoned Atlanta in the middle of the night, and Sherman and Lincoln got the victory that Lincoln needed. All the way back at the beginning of this tour, remember how I told you how important the Battle of Atlanta was to Lincoln getting reelected, the war being ended, and slavery being ended? Well, that's what happened right here. And every single battlefield historian, well, they'll tell you that their battle, the one that they're interpreting, is the most important in the whole war. That's what I'm telling you too. But after we've traveled around Atlanta on the little quiet neighborhoods and on the busy roads, and you've heard about the story of how the Union troops kept the high ground that's now Moreland Avenue and defeated the Confederates on July 22nd, 1864, would you agree with me that this battle is worth remembering? Well, I hope that you've had a good time, and I hope this maybe inspires you to get out on a bicycle and learn a little bit of history. This is Jonah McDonald, and this has been Living History. I'm gonna bicycle back home. See you later.